There's a specific kind of guilt I still carry about how I found out, because I didn't find out from Adrian at all. I found it by accident in a spreadsheet on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, doing the exact same job I'd done 1,000 times before for 100 strangers' companies, never once expecting to see my own husband's name in the driver column. My name is Monica, and I read GPS data for a living. I work for a logistics software company that handles fleet tracking for delivery and distribution businesses, which means my entire job is knowing where a truck actually went versus where its paperwork says it went. Adrian and I have been married 8 years. He spent the last 9 as a route supervisor for coastal beverage distributors, and for 6 of those years, every single Friday, I packed him a lunch before he left for what he called his late shift turkey on rye. An apple cut into quarters. The kind of small, unremarkable ritual that stops feeling like a choice after enough repetition and just becomes who you are to each other. The Tuesday that changed everything started as pure coincidence. My company had just onboarded Coastal as a new client, and I was running a standard verification audit on their fleet accounts, the kind of tedious routine task that usually tells you nothing except that everything is exactly as boring as it should be. Then I saw the name attached to Unit 14. My own husband's name on a client file that had landed on my desk for reasons that had nothing to do with him personally, and everything to do with how small this industry apparently is. I want to back up, though, because the Friday shift itself had a history long before that spreadsheet, and understanding it properly means understanding what came before the ritual ever started. Adrian grew up 2 streets over from a kid named Jonah, the kind of childhood friendship that survives high school, survives Adrian's years working 2 jobs to get through community college, survives everything, except the night 4 years before. Adrian and I ever met when Jonah died in a car accident on a stretch of highway outside town. Adrian mentioned Jonah maybe twice in our first several years together, always briefly, always in a tone that closed the subject before I could ask a real question about it. I assumed the way you assume things about grief you've never been given permission to examine closely, that it was simply an old wound he preferred not to reopen for anyone, including me. 3 years into his job at Coastal, Adrian came home one evening and mentioned that his territory now included Friday afternoon route audits, unpaid overtime work he'd apparently volunteered for, framed as the kind of quiet ambition that might eventually earn him a shot at regional supervisor. I remember being proud of him for it. I remember telling my own coworkers more than once that my husband had started putting in extra hours purely to position himself for a promotion nobody had even offered him yet, holding it up as evidence of exactly the kind of character I'd married him for. It's strange now, looking back, how much of my own understanding of who Adrian was got quietly built on top of a story that had nothing true holding it up. I think about how many small conversations I had across those years that were shaped entirely by a version of Adrian's Friday that didn't actually exist, telling my sister he was probably still stuck at work when she asked why he hadn't called back, apologizing to friends on his behalf for missing things he was supposedly too busy auditing routes to attend. None of those moments felt significant at the time. Together, they added up to years of me acting as an unwitting spokesperson for a life he'd never actually let me see the real shape of. The years that followed unfolded the way most ordinary years do, mostly unremarkable, occasionally interrupted by small details I noticed and then let go of, because noticing something and understanding it are 2 entirely different processes, and I only ever managed the first one at the time. Adrian's coworker Denny mentioned once at a neighborhood cookout that management had asked him to cover Adrian's route one Friday, when Adrian called in with a family matter, and that he'd shown up expecting audit paperwork waiting for him, and found nothing, no forms, no findings, nothing suggesting any actual audit work had happened there before. Denny told the story like a mildly funny mystery, the kind of harmless workplace anecdote you laugh at and forget. I laughed too at the time and refilled his drink and thought about it for exactly as long as it took the next conversation to start. There was a stretch around year 4 when I actually asked Adrian directly what a typical Friday audit involved, hour by hour, mostly out of idle curiosity rather than suspicion, the kind of question you ask a spouse about their workday without expecting anything but an ordinary answer. He gave me one detailed enough to sound complete a description of checklist items and compliance forms that I had no reason at the time to weigh against anything, since I'd never once thought to ask Coastal directly what their actual audit process looked like on paper. I only understood much later how carefully that answer had been built to survive exactly the kind of casual question I'd asked it, and no deeper. Adrian's mother Sharon called more than usual during those years, and there was a particular phone call, maybe 5 years in, where she asked almost carefully whether Adrian still kept in touch with Jonah's widow. I told her I honestly didn't know that Adrian rarely brought up Jonah at all anymore, and she went quiet in a way that felt even then like she'd asked the question expecting a very different answer than the one I gave her. I remember sitting with that silence afterward, longer than the moment itself probably warranted turning it over while I finished the dishes, unable to place exactly what about it had unsettled me. I ran into a coworker from my own office once at a training session, someone who'd handled Coastal's onboarding personally, and she mentioned purely as a data curiosity that one of their vehicles showed a strange fuel pattern every Friday, long stretches of stillness in the middle of what was supposed to be an active route day. I remember finding it interesting in the abstract way you find a stranger's puzzle interesting without ever connecting it to my own kitchen, my own Friday mornings, my own husband's name. I even mentioned it to Adrian that same evening as a funny work anecdote, a driver somewhere apparently parked all afternoon instead of working. He laughed along with me, agreed it sounded odd, and asked what I was making for dinner. I didn't think about it again for almost a year. It was only once I actually had his file in front of me, 3 years of location history for Unit 14, laid out on my screen with the same clinical detachment I'd bring to any client's dataset, that all of those small disconnected moments finally arranged themselves into something I could no longer avoid seeing as a pattern. Every Friday, without exception, the truck left the depot on schedule, drove directly to the same residential address on the edge of town, sat parked there for 4 to 5 hours, and returned to the depot exactly in time to match the hour Adrian usually walked through our front door. I sat with that pattern for a long time before I did anything with it. Reading data for a living teaches you that a single anomaly means almost nothing but a pattern. This consistent held across 3 full years means everything, and I wasn't going to walk into a conversation about it until I understood exactly what I was looking at. I remember closing my laptop that evening and going through the motions of an entirely ordinary night dinner, a show neither of us really watched, Adrian falling asleep on the couch the way he always did on weeknights while I sat beside him doing the math on 3 years of parked Fridays and coming up with nothing that made any sense yet. If you'd found this in your own husband's file, would you have confronted him with the pattern alone, or would you have needed to know what was actually waiting at the end of it first the way I did? Tell me honestly in the comments, because what I found once I finally looked wasn't anywhere close to what 3 years of parked Fridays had led me to brace myself for. I pulled the address through public property records that same evening, the way I'd pull any address for work, and found it belonged to a woman named Dana Whitfield. One more search, an obituary I found within minutes of looking, told me exactly who she was: Jonah's widow. The husband of the accident. Adrian rarely spoke about an accident the article described in a way that made my stomach drop, entirely involving a vehicle Adrian himself had reportedly been driving that night. A detail I was learning 8 years into our marriage for the very first time from a newspaper archive, instead of from him. I read that obituary until the words stopped registering as language and just became a wall I'd walked straight into. I searched for more after that, half against my own better judgment. Old social posts, an archived memorial fundraiser, comments from names I didn't recognize, all of it circling an event Adrian had reduced across 8 years to a single sentence about losing a close friend a long time ago. Sharon called me again a few days later out of nowhere, inviting me to lunch somewhere we'd never been before, and spent most of the meal asking more directly than she usually allowed herself to be whether Adrian and I had been arguing lately, and whether I'd ever actually met any of his oldest friends. I answered honestly, watching something in her posture ease in a way that told me clearly enough who had asked her to check on us. 2 days after that, I told Adrian I was taking a Friday off work, that I wanted to finally see what these audit afternoons actually looked like in person. He hesitated for exactly 1 second before agreeing the same practiced ease he always reached for right before managing an explanation he'd clearly rehearsed more than once in his own head. I drove to Dana's address an hour ahead of him and found a modest house with an unfinished side addition lumber, stacked neatly against the garage in the specific way of a renovation project that's been unfolding slowly across years rather than weeks. A woman in her late 30s answered the door, tired but kind in the face, and something in her expression shifted the moment I told her my name. "You're Monica," she said, not really asking. "I know your husband thinks about how to tell you this every single week," she added, stepping back to let me inside. "I think he's been scared of it longer than either of us wants to admit out loud." Adrian arrived 40 minutes later to find both of us sitting in Dana's half-finished kitchen, the printed GPS history spread across the table between us. 3 years of Friday afternoons reduced to cold, exact timestamps sitting beside whatever explanation he'd been quietly rehearsing this entire time. He stood in the doorway for a moment, keys still in his hand, taking the two of us in, before the shape of what this actually meant seemed to fully land his face, moving through something like confusion and then something much heavier once he registered exactly what documents were spread across that table. "I can explain the address," he started. "You don't have to," I told him. "I've met Dana. I know about Jonah. I have 3 years of your own company's data telling me exactly how long you've been coming here down to the minute." For one long moment, something in him gave way, entirely no performance left in it. Just a man watching years of quiet, private guilt spill into daylight all at once. He told me Jonah died because of a choice Adrian made that night, letting his best friend drive after Adrian was the one who'd actually been drinking a weight he'd apparently carried alone for over a decade, never finding a way to hand any part of it to me, because doing so meant admitting he'd spent 3 years quietly repaying a debt he didn't believe he deserved to ever stop paying, fixing Dana's house, covering repairs she couldn't manage alone, never once telling either of us the whole truth behind why. His voice cracked somewhere in the middle of it, and I watched him reach for the edge of the counter as if he needed something solid to hold on to, while he finally said the sentence out loud for what sounded like the very first time. Then something in him hardened again, exhausted rather than defensive. He said nothing romantic had ever happened here, that he understood exactly what I must have feared for 3 years, and that he'd simply been too ashamed of the accident itself to ever explain any of it honestly to me or to almost anyone. I told him I believed that. That wasn't actually the part that hurt most. What hurt was 3 years of accepting a small, ordinary act of care from me every single Friday morning. While quietly building an entire second life out of guilt he'd decided alone I wasn't allowed to help him carry. He didn't have an answer ready for that. Eventually, he admitted he hadn't known how to tell me any of it, without also confessing the worst thing he'd ever done, and that somewhere along the way, silence had simply become easier to live inside than the conversation he'd owed me from the very beginning of us. Dana spoke for the first time in a while, careful with it. "I told him years ago he needed to tell you," she said. "I think some part of him needed the secret almost as much as he needed to help me. It gave him somewhere to put all of it." She told me she'd never once asked him to keep coming, had told him more than once the work could wait for someone she actually hired, and that he kept showing up anyway every Friday, as if the debt itself were the only relationship he still knew how to fully show up for. I left them there to finally have the conversation neither of them had ever completely had either, about what 3 years had actually meant to each of them separately, and drove home alone with the radio off, unable to hold a single thought long enough to want the noise. Sharon reached out again a week later, this time with nothing left to manage, just relief at finally saying something true. She told me she'd known about the accident since it happened, had watched her son carry it silently for over a decade, and had hoped for years that he'd eventually find his own way to tell me before the truth found its way out sideways instead. She admitted she'd almost told me herself more than once at family dinners on the phone, always losing her nerve at the last moment, uncertain whether it was hers to hand over before Adrian was ready. She asked if I could ever forgive her for staying quiet as long as she had, and I told her honestly that I understood the position she'd been in better than I wanted to caught between loyalty to a grieving son and honesty toward a daughter-in-law she genuinely cared about with no version of that choice that wouldn't have cost her something. A month later, a mutual friend of Adrian and Jonah's, someone from long before I knew either of them, mentioned something Adrian had apparently said once drunk and grieving, less than a year after the funeral, that he didn't think he deserved a version of happiness that didn't cost him something ongoing. That single sentence explained 3 years of quiet Friday penance more completely than anything Adrian himself had managed to say to my face. I sat with it for days, afterward turning over how long a person can carry a private verdict against themselves before it quietly starts shaping every choice they make without anyone else ever being told the reasoning behind it. Denny asked me recently carefully whether I was glad I'd opened that file the day I did, or whether some part of me wished the account had simply never crossed my desk at all. I told him honestly I hadn't fully decided that some days the truth feels like the only thing that could have eventually saved us, and other days it feels like a door that won't fully close again, no matter how much healing happens on the other side of it. He didn't push for a cleaner answer than that which I appreciated more than I said at the time. Adrian started seeing a grief counselor 6 weeks ago, something he'd apparently avoided for over a decade, telling himself the way he seemed to tell himself most things that he didn't deserve the relief it might offer him. I sit in the waiting room some weeks, not because he's asked, but because I'm still working through my own version of what those 3 years meant, a slower process than the confrontation itself ever was. Some sessions he comes out lighter. Some he doesn't say much on the drive home at all, and I've learned not to fill that silence the way I might have a year ago, letting it exist instead of rushing to smooth it over. Adrian stopped going to Dana's alone after that, insisting instead that whatever's left of the renovation happen on weekends when I can be there too. We finished the side edition together 2 Saturdays ago. The 3 of us, an oddly peaceful afternoon none of us could have predicted a few months earlier. I don't know that this story resolves the way these stories usually do. There was no other woman, no lie built for pleasure or convenience, just a man drowning quietly in a debt he never let anyone help him carry. And a marriage now, learning slowly what it means to actually share weight instead of just proximity. Some Fridays, I still find myself reaching for the bread before remembering there's no secret left to build a lunch around, and I've stopped deciding whether that feeling counts as grief or relief, since most days it seems to be both at once. I think sometimes about how differently this might have gone, if that client account had landed on a different analyst's desk that Tuesday, if I'd simply never had a professional reason to run a report on a company I had no personal connection to besides marriage. I don't know how many more years the same Friday ritual could have continued, exactly as it was both of us fully occupied by a version of our life together that only one of us understood completely. I've stopped being able to decide whether that unknown number of years feels like something I mourn or something I was quietly accidentally spared, and I suspect that particular question doesn't actually have a single right answer waiting for me to eventually find it. Dana and I still speak occasionally careful conversations that neither of us has quite figured out how to categorize yet. She told me once that she'd nearly said something to me herself more than a year earlier, catching sight of me at a distance during some overlap. She couldn't remember the details of losing her nerve before she got close enough to actually speak. I told her I understood completely that I knew exactly how easy it is to let someone else's secret sit a little longer than it probably should, especially when you can't yet see what breaking it will cost the people who matter to you. If you've ever uncovered a secret that turned out to be about sorrow instead of betrayal, I want to know in the comments whether that made forgiving it easier or somehow harder than you expected. And if this story found something true in you, pass it along to someone who's ever mistaken silence for a much worse story than the one actually hiding underneath it.